Hoş geldin, Mehmet. Welcome, everybody. We're delighted to welcome the Cypriot writer Mehmet Yashin to the University of Michigan. Mehmet Yashin is the first writer from Cyprus to talk at the university. First, I would like to begin by thanking our sponsors for making this event possible: the Mediterranean Topographies Workshop, Rackham Graduate School, the Institute for the Humanities, Departments of History of Art, History, Linguistics, Comparative Literature, Romanist Languages and Literatures, Modern Greek Studies, Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies, the International Institute, and the Center for European Studies. This event is part of the LSNA theme semester Language, the Human Quintessence. I would also like to express my gratitude to my colleagues at the Mediterranean Topographies who have worked towards the success of this event: Ashley Miller, William Stroebel, and Harry Kashtan, as well as Professor Michelle Hanouche. Mehmet Yashin's literature reflects many aspects of the Eastern Mediterranean culture that complicate our notion of cultural and national belongingness. Try to imagine a writer who was born in the final year of the British colonial rule in Cyprus, within a family of cosmopolitan background in the neighborhood of Neapolis in Nicosia, where families used to have ties with cities such as Yerevan, Antioch, Beirut, Istanbul, London, Rhodes, and Alexandria. This author writes in Turkish and establishes himself as a writer in Istanbul, and is translated and published in most European countries. Despite his many travels, he keeps returning to Nicosia, the city that provided him with his initial writing stimuli, but a place in which he still remains an outcast. Yashin was born in 1958 in Neapolis. In 1963, his family's house was looted and burned. Him and his mother escaped the raid and continued to live as refugees for 11 years in a different area in Cyprus. In 1974, when him and his mother returned to Neapolis, they found the neighborhood occupied by Turkish soldiers and discovered that all of their old Greek, Armenian, and Venetian Catholic origin neighbors had escaped the neighborhood, and Mehmet and his mother had lost all their traces since then. In 1976, Yashin moves to Istanbul to pursue his studies in political science and international relations. He, however, finds himself drawn to writing, and in 1979, he inaugurates his literary career by publishing his early poems in Istanbul, but also in Cyprus, in the Greek Cypriot literary magazine Nea Epochi. In 1985, he publishes his first poetry collection, Sevgilim Olur Asker, and receives the first prize by the Turkish Academy, as well as the Kadir Poetry Prize. In 1986, he publishes another poetry collection entitled Işık Merdiven, which was deemed provocative by the Turkish military establishment of the time, and as a consequence, he's expelled from Turkey in the same year. He then continued his graduate studies at the Center for Byzantine, Ottoman, and Modern Greek Studies at Birmingham University, and after various interruptions, he finishes his PhD in the University of Middlesex. In 1990, he took classes of Greek language and literature at the University of Athens, and during those years, the Athenian literary journal Synchrona Themata publishes part of his work. In the same period, he joined poetry festivals and book readings in Athens, Thessaloniki, Kavala, and Alexandroupolis. In 1994, he publishes his first novel, Soydaşınız Balık Burcu, and in 2005, he publishes a multi-volume chronology of Cypriot literature from 9 BC to 2000, with the title Diller ve Kültürler Arası Bir Edebiyat İncelemesi. In 2010, the Greek newspaper Tanea published an article on Mehmet Yashin with the title The Outsider, that presents his position as a writer of multiple belongings in the Cypriot, Turkish, Turcophone, Mediterranean, but also European and post-colonial literatures. Even though his works have been translated in many languages, and he's one of the most translated writers who write in Turkish language, Yashin does not consider himself only a Turkish writer. Even though a national of Cyprus and of the United Kingdom, he does not write neither in Greek nor in English. And even though he is not a permanent resident of Turkey, and the themes of his poetry do not express the mainstream Turkish intellectual sensibilities in literature, he has taught in the Turkish Academy. In his novel Sınır Dışı Satlar, he has also used the Greek alphabet in the Turkish language known as Karamanlidika, along with Ottoman language, which was the language that some of the Turkish Cypriots still used as an everyday language in the middle of the 20th century in Cyprus. Yashin's work poses great challenges to the Cypriot, the Turkish, and the Greek literary canons because he could belong to all of them simultaneously, but not exclusively. He confesses that they would have erased me if I belonged to only one country. His survival as a prominent writer is the outcome of his belongingness to multiple literary canons. By choosing to locate his work as one of a Cypriot writer, but of a Cypriot who accepts his multicultural and multilingual belonging rather than his national one, allowed him a literary flexibility in the cruel world of nations. Please join me in welcoming Mehmet Yashin.
Thank you to Maria Evkarisume for her generous introduction and for this very kind invitation. Actually, when I was asked to talk on literary space, I thought that most of my poems and plots of my novels were written in my dreams. Should I then be talking about the context of dreams? Perhaps I could talk about my daydreams, an important component of poetic imagination. When poetic inspiration disturbs me, I am neither completely awake nor deeply asleep. Walter Benjamin calls this moment of poetic inspiration the messianic moment. Unexpected stories, hidden poetic associations, and abstract images come from afar to restore forgotten childhood memories. A poet and an author then becomes the space for his literary text. So do I. Messianic moments comes while I am in solitude, when I have isolated myself from physical space. Perhaps this nowhere, my inner self, is more real than any other physical or discursive spaces in the sense of my being. Sometimes, without my awareness, I wake up in an imaginary space somewhere that combines different countries, cities, and houses in which I have lived in different periods of my life. Do I feel in this way that I am not divided into many different pieces in a world that divides, defines, and classifies everything according to the expectations of political, social, and national systems of knowledge? The cultural discourses in the modern world of nation-states force the author's own self to be an antagonistic other to himself, to choose one mother tongue, one religion, one country, one ethnicity, one sexuality, one literary belonging, just one singular this or that identity, and to hide or even destroy other supplements of himself. But if I turn to my dream, the time, language, objects, landscapes, the people in my life and feelings get mixed up each other as they keep changing in this undefined dreamy space. I wrote some verses many years ago about that phenomenon, which you can see, and I confused a little bit earlier. This is a PowerPoint. Some of them, the dreams, go back to childhood. The war hasn't broken out. My mothers are still living. And all the people I know haven't yet left the land. These dreams hark back to a distant time beyond memory. Then suddenly I am flying somewhere in my sleep. Flying, I am flying, but I can't tell where I am, which city, which room, or which bed. Should I lie on my right or on my left? And whose dream language should I use when I answer their questions? As I start taking notes for my talk on the Mediterranean as a literary space, an image spontaneously appeared on my mind. An enormously big and bright blue butterfly. I think it must have flown from one of my experiences in poetry writing. I remember that I dreamt of my mother turning into a blue butterfly. She was very real, flying around my bed, round and round, without saying a word. She told me not to be sad that she has to pass away. Then the butterfly, I mean my mother, had disappeared. I am not sure now if I dreamt it in Greek, because butterfly is a metaphor of soul, psyche in Greek. And although my Greek is poor, I sometimes find myself speaking in Greek in my dreams. I didn't tell this blue butterfly story to anyone, and I didn't write exactly what I had dreamed of. I woke up alone in a small room in the old flat of my late paternal grandmother in Istanbul, and I wrote the following verses. Which death is that, mother? You will be roses and jasmine in our garden. When I wake up, I'll find the flowers watered. And they'll ask, who was it? Then I find dockyard books around. I'll know that you are in the green Morris armchair, wearing your butterfly glasses. But no one else will know. While I was writing this poem in Istanbul, I kept imagining our garden in Nicosia, in the Neapolis neighborhood. I also vaguely imagined the countryside enclave, where we became refugees together with my mother after our home was attacked, looted, and burned down by the paramilitary Greek Cypriot organization EOKA during the Bloody Christmas in 1963. I was only 5 years old at that time, but since this was a very traumatic event, I still remember it. Some of my family members were killed. My aunts and my grandmother became war prisoners at Kiko Monastery. Soon after I wrote this poem, I learned that my mother had cancer, and in a few months she died in our Neapolis home. She couldn't read my poems. They were not published before she died. Although we never talk about it, I knew she expected me to become a poet. One of her great uncles was an Ottoman court poet in the late 19th century. She was in the circle of the woman poets movement in the 1940s and 50s in Cyprus, not as a poetess herself, but as an admirer of poetry. Perhaps her admiration for poetry was the reason that she got married to my father, who was a poet and author from Istanbul, but originally from a Nicosian family. After my father settled down in Cyprus, he worked for a Turkish Cypriot daily, which belonged to my mother's first cousin, her uncle's son. In time, my father established his own printing house and a bookstore. It didn't work as much as I tried to connect my memories about my mother and my father in my dreams, whether these were nightmares or sweet dreams, perhaps because my parents divorced before I was born. It seems to me that poets unintentionally select parts of their memories and reinterpret them, and in the writing process, the fictional ones turn into reality. The literary space that poets and authors produce in is not necessarily identical with the space where they were born or lived, but it is a space that they themselves produce. I am not sure if a poet or an author writes about what he lives or he lives in what he writes. Or if the answer is both, which one is more meaningful. For instance, I wrote The Typewriter, thinking, oh my father, the typewriter as an object is real, but the narrative about it is fictional. Since I've projected my experience with my father and my feelings for him onto it, the typewriter became a metaphor for affection. He should have left something for me as a souvenir. I chose this typewriter myself that day. 50s, A keyboard. Keys hardly shift, some characters appear crooked. But I imagine him young, typing his love poems, his fingers trembling with emotion. Then I imagine he gave it to me as a gift when I was older. This typewriter, his very first treasure. And by recounting this story to everyone after time, I began to believe that it was all true, what I had dreamed up. In fact, to leave us behind, he had sold the whole kit and bottle, and like a fearful sparrow pecking on discarded fruit, I put this typewriter out from a pile of his letter at our doorstep, and hurried back into the house lest I should be called a thief. I still keep the typewriter as a reminder to myself not to follow the literary footsteps of my ancestors. Each of them was a victim of different identity politics. Their names became known because of the collective political interpretations of their poems. The aesthetic quality of their works decreased as much as their necessity of specific national identities in an isolated small community increased. I think approach to the study of minor or peripheral literatures are appropriate for analyzing their works, but not quite. I don't think that they were minor and peripheral in comparison with the Greek Cypriots, who are also minor and peripheral. First of all, none of these Turkish Cypriot poets wrote in Greek, but in Ottoman, modern Turkish, English, and partly in French. Both Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots literary circles are dominated by their so-called motherlands. In order to be considered real Turks, real and Greeks, Cypriots need to be peripheral in the fictional national identities which cause the division of their country. Even Taner Baybars, my mother's second cousin, her aunt's grandson, who was considered the most important English-writing Cypriot poet, remained secondary and ignorable for the literary establishments as well as the book markets in all languages in which he wrote. One can see the deterritorization of languages in his books in the sense in which Deleuze and Guattari analyze in their concept of minor literature. Baybars's in-betweenness would not give much chance to him to be fully integrated into national Turkish, British, or Cypriot literary canons in the 1950s. His first poetry collection was Turkish and published in Cyprus in 1953. After half a century, his last poetry collection, which couldn't find a publisher, was in French language. He left Cyprus forever just after his first book was published. In the same year, a self-declared Mediterranean poet and novelist, Lawrence Durrell, moved to Cyprus, and Yorgos Seferis followed him within a year's time. I think Durrell and Seferis deserve to be restudied in the light of their literary activities in Cyprus in the context of Mediterranean, peripheral, post-colonial, Orientalist, and national discourses, not only in the framework of just one of these discourses, but comparatively. The reading of poetry should go beyond disciplinary boundaries. A poetry collection can be analyzed on many different layers without being reduced to a singular academic discipline. Observing my students as visiting lecturer at different universities in London, Nicosia, and Istanbul, I am amazed how different literary theories casts spells on them more than poetry and literature itself. They are usually not interested in novels for aesthetic enjoyment, nor to explore new ideas and styles, but to adapt it to a certain discourse which already exists in their mind as a pretext. Without reading books of a poet or novelist, they feel free to make comments about the literary position of his works. Most authors from non-English writing and non-Nordic countries find themselves in the position that either they will be whatever kind of author an academic paper would like them to be, or their works won't be a subject of a study and not acknowledged. This is also the demand of the book market, which usually goes in parallel with academic discourses. The publishing industry follows literary studies carefully, but I am not sure if literary study follows the global publishing industry in a way that it is aware enough of the connection between literature and the market. Another interesting observation through my former students is that they wouldn't analyze the book they choose through another known literary theory so it suited the theory in their minds. They rather kept insisting on framing the book they read in the particular theory. If a novel wouldn't match with the intended theory, something must be wrong with the novel, not the theory. Most of my students usually wouldn't read a poetry book to get an inspiration contrary to the bodies of theory which they have been taught. They would rather pre-classify poets and authors according to the discourses through which they have been thought to conceptualize. I think this is because theory has giant priority over poetry for most of them. Baybars's first poetry book, the only one written in Turkish, was acknowledged as Turkish Cypriot literature, but not all his other works in English and French. Since he wrote in English and French, as a Catholic man, he appeared useless for the reproduction of the collective identity of the Turkish Cypriot minority, and the highly nationalist and unsophisticated Turkish Cypriot literary establishment ignored his works. His books were never accepted as a part of mainland Turkish literature. He was not studied or acknowledged as a Cypriot poet either. Because of the official discourse of the Republic of Cyprus, being a Cypriot author only means being Greek Cypriot, and being a Greek Cypriot author means being Christian Orthodox and writing in Greek. Baybars had none of these characteristics. Although he considered himself British and was a part of a Londoner poetry group in the 1960s and 70s, he remained a stranger for English literature. After he published his first poetry collection entitled To Catch the Falling Man in 1963, Terry Eagleton wrote, "He knows how to make use of the silence, of the suggestive spaces between images." Despite that, Baybars hasn't been studied as a post-colonial author of that time. This example shows that to belong to a body of literature is not only a matter of language, tradition, ethnic background, citizenship, place for publication, or literary tendencies, but a combination of all this. An author does not usually determine his belonging on his own, but is defined by the needs of the political system. For instance, there are some Greek Cypriot poets who would belong in mainland Greek literature. And there are some Turkish Cypriot poets who would like to belong in a common Cypriot literature. But neither are accepted by the literary canons of these nation states. Most acknowledged Greek Cypriot poets still keep the 19th century understanding of national belonging and language, as well as the literary style and themes. By contrast, the works of English writing Cypriots are not anachronistic in the same fashion, because of the English language presents itself as a universal literary language, not only a national one like Greek and Turkish. As a result, this English is more open to recent literary tendencies. It is true that Terry Eagleton, as a universalist and popular Marxist literary critic in Britain, show more interest in Nazım Hikmet's poetry, translated by Taner Baybars, than in Baybars's own poetry. Baybars was one of the first translators of Nazım Hikmet, a prominent modern Turkish poet, into English. He published 3 poetry collections in 1967, in 1970, and in 1972 in London. During these years, I had read the complete poems of Hikmet, published in Bulgaria, in Turkish, without censorship. The books were given to my father as a gift in Cyprus, and while mainland Turks were not able to read Nazım Hikmet, I had a chance to learn his poetry. Under Cold War policies, communist and socialist ideas could not be expressed even in a literary work in Turkey. The political situation was completely the opposite for Bulgarian Turks, which compose 1 in 5 of the total Bulgarian population, like the Turkish community in Cyprus. It was very courageous for a Turk to translate Nazım Hikmet, who was accused of being a traitor in Turkey and escaped to Moscow. Since Baybars was not from Turkey and had no expectations from the Turkish literary establishment, he actualized that translations. I remember as a graduate student in 1984, I interviewed Nazım Hikmet's son, Mehmet Fuat, in Istanbul. Mehmet Fuat at the time was considered one of the main poetry critics of Turkey. He reacted negatively to my question about Hikmet's cosmopolitanism. He perceived the word cosmopolitan as equivalent to cultural corruption, the suggestion that Hikmet might be a perverse bohemian or a collaborator with foreigner capitalists. For Fuat, as for other conventional Turkish socialists of this time, the non-Muslim minorities of Turkey, cosmopolitans, were considered tools of the imperialist West. Nazım Hikmet's poems are not clean from this kind of socialist and third world nationalist interpretations. He celebrated the national liberation of Turks in his epic-style poems, with no mention to the genocides and exiles of the non-Muslim communities, such as Pontian and Asia Minor Greeks. He said nothing about what happened to the Armenian people during the First World War and their extermination by the Young Turks. He didn't question the racist implications for Jewish characters represented in a stereotypical way in his narrative poems written after the Second World War. But while Yorgos Seferis supported Enosis, unification with Greece, Hikmet did not support the Turkish Cypriot demand Taksim, the partition of the island. He sent a letter through the Turkish Cypriot executive member of the powerful Cypriot Communist Party and asked Turkish Cypriots to unite with Greek Cypriots. Soon after, Taner Baybars moved from London to France. In the late 1980s, he began to write in French. It was difficult to translate his poems, not only because of his unusual English, but due to his use of Turkish, Ottoman, Greek, French, and Latin words and cultural references. It was strange for mainland Turks to read the poetry of a Turkish Cypriot, full of references to Christian saints alongside ironic eroticism, British sensibility with metaphors of Mediterranean landscape, and Ottoman expressions in BBC English verses. Eventually, no one else, but I had to translate and introduce him to Turkey in 1997 to prove to the literary establishment the cosmopolitans like me are also rooted. Because, as I wrote in one of my poems, I was often unsure in which language to shed tears. The life I live wasn't foreign, but one of translation. My mother tongue one thing, my motherland another, and I again altogether different. Even in those days of blackouts, it became obvious I could never be a poet of any country, because I belong to a minority, and freedom is still a little word, uneasy in any nation's lexicon. One of my other questions to Mehmet Fuat in the interview was about the literatures of Ottoman Turkish origin communities living in almost all the Balkan countries as well as in Cyprus. He didn't know much about those minorities, and he added off the record that I shouldn't spend my time on secondary poets. A decade after this conversation, Fuat became my editor, and along with my poetry collections, he published my essays critical of modernist and nationalist literary tendencies and discourses in Turkey. My writing was an attempt to denationalize the literature in the Turkish language, and I suggested the term of Turkophone literature rather than the existing term of the literature of Turks. Although Mehmet Fuat did not agree with me, he still replied the harsh critics of my opinion in 1995 by saying Yashin made Turkish literature consider what it wouldn't consider. But thinking of a problematic issue does not always result in change. It was not strange that the literary establishment in Turkey didn't know much about the modern Turkish language literatures of Cyprus, Bulgaria, and ex-Yugoslavian countries. The literatures of Turkish Jews, Armenians, and Greeks, and their vital contributions during the foundation of modern Turkish language literature was also concealed and glossed over as well. Officially, modern Turkish literature emerged with the works of the mid of the 19th century. These works were written in the Arabic alphabet by Ottoman Muslim authors. But as a matter of fact, modern Turkish literature could go back to the mid of 18th century, when Turkish language works were written in the Armenian and Greek alphabets by Armenian and Greek Ottomans. Nationalism in literature is not always aggressive. It has, in more sophisticated ways, transformed mainstream Turkish writing. Turkish literature has considered what it wouldn't have, and now it is not against Armenians, Greeks, and Jews. On the contrary, it laments that they have disappeared from Turkey. They are remembered with a nostalgic taste in the works of post-1980s Turkish literature. I need to say, my works shouldn't be confused with this lamentation and melancholy for the old cosmopolitan Istanbul or the idea of the lost Levant, which is fashionable in Turkey. I shouldn't also be confused with the bicommunalist poetry of Cypriots that cries for the good old days of coexistence. I can't share these Turkish and Cypriot literary tendencies, not only because they are cliché, but also because they reproduce nationalisms by default. Their claims step on the otherness of different communities, ignoring hybrid and multiple cultures which still exist in Turkey and Cyprus. I couldn't possibly be a part of these tendencies of of Turkish and Cypriot literatures vis-à-vis their complex past and their cosmopolitan minorities. Because I myself, from that background, as it reflects in my literary works. Indeed, my experience of living in some sort of purgatory-like in-betweenness is reflected in my works that include some ghostly characters or apparitions living in ghostly spaces. In The Hours of Deportation, one of my novels, the place of the narrative could be anywhere in our world or in the world of the afterlife. Perhaps a Mediterranean seashore or Levant country or a Varosha-like Cypriot ghost town, or since I also use the Karamanidika language in the novel, it may be in the Cappadocia region of Turkey, the former homeland of Karamanli people, who were known as neither completely Greeks nor Turks. The characters of the novel remain ghosts, and the tales they are telling imply an afterlife. However, the narrative takes place neither in heaven nor in hell, but in purgatory, in an underground shelter or a prison, perhaps in some sort of buffer zone. Literary space relates on the language of the souls and to images of consciousness. It was possible to talk here only about my Neapolis house in Nicosia, because it is an immense source of poetic images for my childhood that always come to me with intensity and intimacy. Perhaps a poet or an author needs to be haunted by the childhood ghosts of his house. Even more, perhaps he needs to self-exile himself from the so-called real world and turn to his own ghost. In my poem entitled A Ghost, a phantom returns to his home to take care of it. But by doing this, it means to take revenge, because he strives to keep alive a place that was killed. Only as a ghost can I now return to my own home. Emerging from blurred mirrors, I haven't much time. I threw the windows open in pitch dark starlight. The avenging angels of this polyglot house was silence. Make everyone who enters it promise to write against wars, against everything jingoes, even tongues. Sprinkle the ant killer around like enchanted words. And I am off again. No one has even seen me. I am a phantom. They can't have me killed. But let's return to another haunted place, the flat of my grandmother, my father's childhood home in Istanbul, where I dreamt of the big blue butterfly. It is located in the old Istanbul, not far from Fanar, where the seat of ecumenical Greek Orthodox Patriarch is located. Sorry. It is close to Sfendones Wall, the only remains of the Byzantine hippodrome, Saraçhane, the biggest Ottoman aqueduct, and a very old Turkish bath, which I believe has been converted from kind of a Byzantine structure. They are all nearby and all in an uncanny position. When I was living there, people would drink and having sex here and there in dark nights. One side of the street goes to the Golden Horn, and the other side, where I prefer to take walks, goes to the Marmara Sea, passing through parks where granite Byzantine lions still eats cows, lots of kitsch modern shopping centers, bars, and a small mosque sides by sides, till the square of Armenian taverns, and then the port. Once upon a time, my grandmother's neighborhood was elegant, and my father didn't accept the new reality of his literary space. He pretended that his childhood neighborhood has not turned to a lowly and unsafe area of Istanbul, just like I blinded myself in order not to see the dramatic changing of the Neapolis neighborhood of my childhood, Nicosia. My father returned to his mother's flat after he retired, and he wrote his memoirs about his life in Cyprus. The physical distance from the space of the island brought him to the space of his memoirs in the island. Phantom-like poetic images can fly very fast, without any interruption to their own space, regardless of the author's place of writing. Besides, ghosts don't like the graveyards, but the houses where they once lived in intimacy. When I used to live in my grandmother's flat in Istanbul in the early 1980s, it was unpleasant for me to walk to the Fanaryon side of the neighborhood. I wouldn't see the Greek houses, initially deserted under the terror of Turkish nationalism in 1950s and 60s, as a retaliation to Greek atrocities against Turks in Cyprus. To see the ruins of Phanarion Greek houses as the monument of revenge in the name of my looted and burned home in Neapolis was a burden for me. On the other hand, it helped me put in perspective all those nationalist conflicts in the vast Greek-Turkish world and got interested in broader literary sources. Some of these Greek houses were escorted by poor, mostly Kurdish immigrants. Even my most Philhellene mainland Turkish friends couldn't see what I saw in this space. They had pity for the poor Kurds, not aware of the fact that the ghosts of homeless Phanariot Greeks still live outside their stolen homes. If memories and affect would not fill a place, it can only be a place of emptiness, never be a literary space for an author. My memories were different from my Istanbul Turkish friends. I and they perceive the same places differently. Therefore, I wrote differently. I think the personal experiences of an author and their relation with the creative process needs to be given more attention. I can't blame my Turkish friends in Istanbul that they were not born like me in Neapolis. I remember Armenian, Maronite, English expatriate, Italian, Alexandrian, Greek, Rhodesian Turks, neighbors alongside with Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots. Actually, I shouldn't be dividing them into this or that community because most of them had mixed marriages and relatives from different communities, just like my own family. Today's national, ethnic, and religious identity definitions have been normalized by many people as if they were natural. But I have no memory about those defined identities from my early childhood. For instance, I didn't know that I am Turkish before the EOKA attack. Because languages and religions also were also mixed. While our Armenian neighbors spoke perfect Turkish, my cousin's wife didn't know Turkish, only English. I remember how frequently we went to Agios Andreas, the Greek Orthodox Church, for the wedding and baptism ceremonies of our neighbors. In turn, because of Turkish secularism, none of the social occasions we attended involve us going to the mosque. I went to a mosque for the first time while I was in secondary school, together with my class, to make a painting of the Saint Sophia Cathedral, which was converted into a mosque by the Ottomans in the 16th century. The Ottomans didn't only convert French and Italian Gothic churches into mosques, but their populations into Islam too. What I experience and what I choose as my literary heritage reflects the position of my work as other. I am the other everywhere, only the references of my otherness change from place to place. As you know, being other isn't identical with the concept of marginal, minor, or outsider. The literary system has a complex and multiple dynamism. A minor can be major and a peripheral author central in different levels of the system. Being an outsider doesn't mean that you are not in the literary system. After many years have passed, I realized that the ghostly existence of my literary works in Cyprus and Turkey makes them more genuine and therefore more powerful. When my first poetry book was banned after the military coup in Turkey and I was subjected to oppression and censorship and then deported from Turkey in 1986, I left Istanbul for London and I dedicated a poem to one of my Phanariot Istanbul Greek friends, saying, "A native stranger here, a stranger native there, child dangling his feet by drifting waters, There is nowhere a homeland for you or for me. Child dangling his feet by drifting waters. I run through surrounding streets, 60 crescenting sweets in my hand, running, running. Believe me, one grows up more beautiful, defeated by the world. We froze, face to face, two men of white marble upholding the portals. If we leave, this city will fall. If we stay, we should stay, we say, but the bollards knows us both, though the ships don't. They go past our toes, blowing screams of smoke. Seagulls fly in vain. The cosmopolitan and hybrid cultural sources, supposedly one of the distinctive elements of Mediterranean literary discourse, have almost been defeated. It's as if they have disappeared in Eastern Mediterranean cities in the name of some other literary theories, such as national, post-colonial, and third world literatures. I am aware how limited and problematic Lawrence Darrell's reference to Levantine cosmopolitanism was. For me, however, the term cosmopolitanism is simply a reference to the people of my childhood neighborhood, Neapolis, and their daily lifestyle. It is understood by Lawrence Darrell's letters that Yorgos Seferis contacted him before he arrived to Cyprus. Indeed, Seferis preferred to be in the circle of Darrell-like famous Western authors rather than in the circles of local Greek Cypriot literary personalities. In 1955, he published a collection of poems in this island entitled Cyprus, Imorologia Katastromatos. It is true that some Greek Cypriot artists were inspired by Seferis, but he didn't consider himself as equal with the local artists and authors. He gives an impression that he considered them lower than himself, and he didn't pay much attention to them. His attitude of superiority vis-à-vis Cypriots was no less than that of Darrell. Lawrence Darrell also published a poetry book in 1955 entitled The Tree of Idleness, inspired from his time in Cyprus. And actually, it is this book that made him a publicly recognized poet in Britain. Obviously, Yorgos Seferis needed to recover from the Megali catastrophe's devastating effects on his life, and Cyprus was an ideological promise, at least some kind of a healing space for Greeks and for Hellenism. He was interested in this mythological island, its Homeric sea and nature, and its ancient Greek gods. Real Greek Cypriots and their daily life would irritate his elitist and imaginary Hellenism. If we look at the photographs taken by Seferis while he was in Cyprus, we can see what he wouldn't want to see. There are no photographs of non-Greek people and architecture, particularly no mosques and Turkish Cypriot folk. Seferis always presented himself as a politically unengaged poet, which could translate as not being leftist. Since Seferis did not think of national matters as political, he could argue that he was above and beyond issues related to politics. But his supposed disconnection with politics was interrupted when he became politically active for Cyprus. He lobbied for Enosis and Eoka. Like most modern Greek poets, he adopted Eurocentric ideas from the West and orientalized his eastern neighbors, such as the Turks. He pretended to himself, perhaps more than he pretended to Westerners, that he had no connection to Turkish Muslim culture, as if he was not born and grew up in Asia Minor. The problem is that today, Cyprus seems more Western and Northern than Greece in its social, economic, administrative, educational structure, as well as political and cultural connections. For this reason, the mainland Greek and Turkish intellectuals have a quite complex relation to both Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots. On the one hand, they assume that Cyprus is peripheral and minor and must be in a lower hierarchical rank, but on the other hand, they find the island more Europeanized than themselves. One can observe this uncomfortable relation to Cyprus even in the work of Seferis. On the one hand, he was against British colonial rule, and on the other hand, he admired the Western influence on the island because as a result of it, Cypriots became more European, which Seferis would like to be as a Greek man, originally from a coastal town of Anatolia, meaning the East. Dominant and dominated spaces in literary system have many aspects in their relations. A literary work that originated from a dominated literature can emerge within the central position in the hierarchy. It may create a new understanding, influence the established literature, and cause it to change. Because of the language tie with Greek and Turkish, Cyprus may be thought of as a peripheral area within larger spaces. And it can be compared with Belgium, Switzerland, and Austria in the context of their relations to the German and French languages. The example of Franz Kafka, who was not only part of the European Jewish community and Czech literature, but also the German language, shows the possibility that a writer from a language-wise dominated a smaller country could play an innovative role in a literary center. One can see the complex hierarchical relations between dominant and dominated spaces within the example of the language of the mainland Turkish settlers in northern Cyprus. It was expected by the Turkish authorities that Turkish settlers would assimilate Turkish Cypriots into the mainland culture, including its language. Despite this mission, however, and the huge support of the Turkish media and Turkish educational system in northern Cyprus, which are all based upon Turkey's official dialect and dictionary, Turkish settlers have adapted themselves to the Turkish Cypriot dialect and dictionary. Because in their imagination, the local Turkish Cypriot language represents being more European and higher social status compared with Turkey. But because the position of the written language is different from the spoken one, Turkey's literary canon does not perceive the Turkish dialect of Cyprus in the same way that Turkish settlers do. Literary works always need to be analyzed in a complex way. For instance, a Western literary critic of Lawrence Durrell's book Bitter Lemons applies of colonial theory to his analysis in 2003 and blames Durrell for his attempt to de-Hellenize Cyprus in order to prevent enosis. In this notion of de-Hellenization, we can read exactly the opposite, the Hellenization of Cyprus. In the ethnocentric essentialism, the island is imagined as having one homogeneous and unchanged Hellenic identity in 3,000 years. According to this understanding, the non-Greek civilizations of Cyprus in thousands of years are all occupiers, foreigners and Occidentals, and they will remain so forever. Not only Turkish Cypriots, but Maronite, Armenian, English, Arab, French, and Italian origin Cypriots couldn't be accepted as authentic Cypriots. Since this approach of essay I'm referring to was represented at the 5th Annual Congress of the Mediterranean Studies Association at the University of Granada in 2002, we can see how the Mediterranean discourse is manipulated by Eurocentrism and national ideologies. In the idealization or adoration for the Mediterranean, usually non-European and non-Christian elements are imagined as fantasy elements. It seems that the notion of Mediterranean literature is considered the secondary best alternative to being incorporated into the Western literary canon. Therefore, as a marketing strategy, an Egyptian author could choose to work around the idea of Mediterranean literature rather than Middle Eastern, Islamic, and Third World literature. He could then have more chance to enter the international book market. The critic of Darrell, that I previously mentioned, argues that Darrell emphasized the Levant connection of Cyprus and its Gothic architecture too much. He also says that Darrell wrote that Cyprus is more eastern than its landscape suggests in order to spiritually move the island closer to Turkey. Additionally, the author argues that Darrell labeled the anti-colonialist liberation struggle of EOKA as a terrorist one. I think that the author of this essay did not take enough time to research whether Darrell's points reflected some kind of reality or not. My question is, how could we reinterpret Lawrence Darrell's points without reproducing a colonial agenda? My poem, Fox Hunting, I think challenges such interpretation of the context of post-colonial theory. The poem begins in English. I have not called the EOKA a fascist and racist terror organization, but a national liberator, the name with which they identify themselves. Once EOKA became known as the symbol of liberation, then the idea of liberation was identified with the terror. The hunters are approaching. Oh God, may they never shoot the fox with those guns while the sun is setting. The national liberators who looted even our bedroom, may they never steal our enchanted box as well. Don't you know what a dodger the fox is? Said the voice of the guide. The fox is so selfish, cunning and filthy, can steal the milk from tea, can hide in the eye of a needle, needle, needle. My granny says, children are afraid of blood. If you shoot, we'll look the other way. A prejudiced literary study looks the other way while children get killed. In the paper I refer to, post-colonial theoretical points turn to some sort of religious belief. Since the sacrifice is done in the name of God, in this case post-colonial theory, one could justify massacres, military coup, and all atrocities against others. EOKA was actually involved in the killing of more Greek Cypriots who did not support unification with Greece than British and Turkish Cypriots. Even if the non-Greek communities of the island would be ignored, Greek Cypriots still have a right to be a different kind of Hellenic nation than Greece. It might be even annoying for the writer to know that a sizable proportion of Greek Cypriots were against Enosis too, since the title of his paper is Lawrence Darrell in Cyprus, a Philhellene against Enosis. Insensitive generalization for the sake of any theory can't help us to neither feel nor understand a literary work. I would rather read a study about Darrell, who claims to be a Mediterranean author, considering the fact that he was not born in a Mediterranean country, but he chose to be so. Why did he choose? Were his books successful in representing Mediterranean cultures? Could we compare him to Seferis, who, even though born in an Eastern Mediterranean country, chose to be a Western European? Did ancient Greek myth that both Darrell and Seferis love play more of a role in the founding of modern Greek nationalism or strengthening of Eurocentrism? Discussing the literature of Cyprus is even more of a difficult task, and hence a more challenging one, that of the other Mediterranean islands. Cyprus invites one to rethink existing theories and perhaps create new approaches to analyze literary works. It is because the literatures of the island have always been more complex and force one to ask more complex questions. Language and its relation with nationhood is only one aspect of this complexity. The main language of Cyprus is Kypriaga, the Greek dialect of Cyprus, but it is neither an official language nor has it been recognized as a modern literary language. According to some linguistics, Kypriaga has developed under the influence of Italian and Turkish. Its sounds, dictionary, idiomatic words, and grammatical structures make it evident. For instance, while the sound of she alludes to Turkish, the sounds of che alludes Italian, and these sounds do not exist in the mainland version of Greek language. Although Kypriaga is used in the everyday life of Cyprus and recited in traditional literature by Piedarides, folk poets, only modern Greek language is accepted as the official, high, and hence literary language of the island. Apart from modern Greek, Turkish and British English are the other two official languages of Cyprus. Indeed, modern Cypriot literature was taken shape as a trilingual literature in the early 20th century before independence in 1960s. While use of modern Greek renders Greek writing Cypriot authors integral to the national literature of Greece, the use of modern Turkish also suggests the integration of Turkish writing Cypriot authors to Turkey. Ironically, some Cypriot scholars claim that the mainland Greek and Turkish languages have played a more manipulative role than the English language on the island. English language literatures has renewed and enriched itself by opening itself to authors from many different nationalities. It is possible to say that English writing Cypriots do not necessarily need to be a part of English cultural identity or British nationhood. In the case of Greek and Turkish writing Cypriots, however, these writers are forced to ideologically incorporate their writing in their respective mainland nations. This indirect ideological reinforcement to integrate into national literary traditions comes from the nature of the nationalist ideologies in which Greek and Turkish literatures and publication industries are respectively embedded. On the other hand, it is unavoidable for Greek writing or Turkish writing Cypriots to somehow connect with Athens or Istanbul as their literary metropoles. Because of the unprofessional structure and peripheral position of literature in a small island, the periphery can't easily escape from the past while the center runs to the future. Because of this phenomenon, the peripheral literatures become closed into themselves rather than connecting with the outside world. But one should also remember that the quality of the works of an individual author could not always be identical with the position of the minor or dominated literary establishment, as we know through the examples of Kafka and James Joyce. I have to admit that the theoretical subjects about which I am talking here do not usually make me busy when I write my poetry or prose. Although I write in Istanbul Turkish, the strong male voice of the official language of Turkey represents militarism and authoritarianism for me. I could say that I have created my own Turkish by combining Ottoman, Cypriot Turkish, Karamanlidika, Greek writing Turkish, and the Turkish spoken by Jewish, Greek, and other cosmopolitan minorities within modern Istanbul Turkish. The island where I came from has always been a polyglot place. The official history of the literature of Cyprus begins in the 7th century BC with ancient Greek, and the patterns go as Byzantine Greek, Demotic Greek, modern Greek. But in the 1990s, I transferred Phoenician writing epigraphs from the 9th century BC into poetry. Therefore, unofficial Cypriot literature began 2 centuries earlier. Even tombstones from ancient Cyprus had mixed languages between the Greek and the Phoenician. Multilingual traditions continue in medieval times between the Lusignan French and Byzantine Greek and Kypriaga, and later Venetian Italian replaced French. Cyprus has lots of mixed language proses and poems between French and Kypriaga as well as Italian and Kypriaga. After the 16th century, Ottoman Turkish and then modern Turkish and English became literary languages of Cyprus alongside Demotiki and modern Greek. It is possible to find similar polyglot literary sources in other Mediterranean countries such as Crete and Sicily. But these islands are parts of Greece and Italy. Therefore, no one expects from them to have their own distinctive national literatures like it is expected from the Republic of Cyprus. As a matter of fact, Crete has its own sub-literary establishments in Greek literature as Sicily has in Italian literature. One could expect from Cyprus to have a more independent and a strong literary establishment than Sicily and Crete have. Malta, another independent Mediterranean island, is quite different from Cyprus. Malta has its own language and national literary canon. It is true that Maltese authors also engage with Italian and English language literatures, yet the literary culture of Malta is based on the Maltese language, which is spoken by 300,000 people. Maltese authors would not write in the language of their oppressors. For instance, contemporary Cypriot poetry includes some works in Greek against the Greek military coup on the island. It also includes some poems in Turkish criticize the Turkish invasion in 1974. These poems were written in the languages and the official dialect of the external oppressive powers which the authors criticize. This situation may immediately remind the case of post-colonial literatures, but it is different. Since Greece was not a colonizer on the island, and the Greek language, as a native tongue, has thousands years long history in Cyprus, one needs to analyze power relations within the same language with a different approach. If you ask my opinion, the sea is much more important than the land for islanders. The thousands of years long literary heritage and the outside connections of Cyprus are much more important than its land as a literary space. One could rightly say that, considering its rich cultural heritage, Cyprus is bigger than its actual size. But the literary structure of modern Cyprus is not strong enough to support its own authors. The literary establishments of Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots are very problematic, both ideologically and professionally. Therefore, it would be wiser, I think, to follow the path of James Joyce in his context of language and relation with local, national, and global literary canons. I have shared here with you my childhood memories, my experiences as a writer, and I open the houses to you where I live. I have told you only what I remember, but what I forgot, perhaps more important in my literary work. After this long talk, I would be interested in to hear your reflections, interpretations. Thank you so much. Thank you.